What makes this different is not that Iran sounded angry. Iran always sounds angry. What makes this different is that the threat stopped sounding like geopolitics and started sounding like instructions for people who thought they worked in office space, not war space. Iran's Revolutionary Guard did not just threaten America in the abstract. It issued a 1-kilometer evacuation order around the Middle East sites of 18 companies it said could be targeted from 2000 Tehran time. The second a war gets an evacuation radius around office locations, the story is already past the safe version. Then the warning turned personal. Employees of the named institutions were told to leave their workplaces immediately to preserve their lives. That is not diplomatic theater anymore. That is a state trying to make workers feel that the building they walked into this morning may no longer count as civilian space. And these were not vague American interests. The list tied a start time to names people know instantly. Microsoft, Google, Apple, Intel, IBM, Tesla, and Boeing. Once companies like that are put on a clock, the audience is no longer wondering whether the war is escalating. They are wondering why the response does not sound equally sharp. If you want the layer beneath the headline instead of the safe version built for TV, subscribe now and tell me in the comments what you think this really means when office sites start getting war warnings. Is this still deterrence? Or is this the moment the battlefield officially moved into the private infrastructure of American power? Here is the line that blows up the surface story. Iran said these companies should expect the destruction of their relevant units from a specific hour onward, in exchange for each assassination in Iran. That is not just rage. That is Tehran trying to redefine the war so corporate infrastructure is no longer adjacent to conflict, but inside it. And that is exactly where the title has to hit. Because the most violent part of this story is not the threat by itself. It is the mismatch between how specific the threat sounded and how unspecific Washington sounded when the names on that list were some of the most powerful companies on Earth. The viewer did not click just to hear that Iran is mad. The viewer clicked because the title promises something darker. Tehran names the companies, names the time, names the radius, names the logic. And then Trump does not meet that moment with a public answer that feels equal to the danger. That is the silence people feel, even when words are technically still being spoken. And then came the sentence that turns the title from a tease into a gut punch. When Trump was asked whether he was concerned about threats to the companies, he said no. That may have been meant as confidence, but with 18 firms under a timed threat, it lands like a shrug over a battlefield that just moved into places people thought were off limits. That is why this story is so clickable right now. Not because the threat is cinematic, but because the emotional math is brutal. Workers were told to leave. Residents were told to clear a radius. The household names were put on a target list. And the public answer from the top of the U.S. system did not sound like a leader staring directly at that shift. Now be careful here, because this is where most coverage goes soft. Trump said no is not the same as literal silence. But literal silence is not what the title is really about. The title is about a response gap. Iran sounded intimate, immediate, and address level. Trump sounded detached, broad, and unwilling to publicly inhabit the fear Tehran was trying to create. The White House answer followed the same pattern. It said the U.S. military was prepared to curtail any attacks and pointed to a sharp drop in Iranian missile and drone attacks. That is clean deterrence language, but it is still generic deterrence language. It does not publicly answer the narrower question that hit viewers in the gut. What exactly protects named private sites once the war starts speaking directly to them? That is the hidden pressure inside the title. Tehran did not threaten a country in the abstract. It threatened the architecture through which U.S. power lives in the region. And Washington answered at the level of, we are prepared, not at the level of, here is what happens when private infrastructure becomes a declared target set. That difference matters because clarity itself is a weapon in a story like this. Allies need it. Workers need it. Markets need it. Host governments need it. The public can tolerate a lot of danger if leadership sounds like it sees the exact shape of the danger. What unnerves people is when the threat is more concrete than the reassurance. And once you notice that mismatch, the whole title starts paying off much faster. Trump does not have to literally fall silent. He only has to sound less specific than the event itself. He only has to sound more comfortable talking about ending the war than talking about what it means that the war just moved closer to Microsoft, Google, Apple, Boeing, and the rest. But why these companies? Why this list? Why not just threaten bases, ports, or embassies? Because Tehran is doing something bigger than issuing a warning. It is trying to redraw the battlefield in public and tell the region that modern American power does not live only in uniforms and runways. It lives in data centers, analytics platforms, finance channels, AI systems, industrial support, and corporate campuses. Look at the structure of the list, not just the fame of the names. Cisco, HP, Intel, Oracle, Microsoft, Apple, Google, Meta, IBM, Dell, Palantir, NVIDIA, JP Morgan, Tesla, GE, Spire Solution, Boeing, and even G42 were grouped together. That is not a random rage list. It is a systems list built around compute, software, finance, industry, aerospace, and strategic support. A systems list tells you exactly what Tehran wants the audience to understand. It wants this war read not as a clean state-on-state contest, but as a networked struggle where private entities help the contest. Enemy see better, process faster, target more accurately, finance more smoothly, and project more power. In other words, the war is no longer just about the weapons, it is about the systems that make the weapons matter. That is a psychologically violent idea for an American audience because these are not shadowy shell companies nobody has heard of. These are names inside daily life, retirement accounts, phones, search bars, airports, and enterprise systems. The shock is not only that Iran threatened them, the shock is that Tehran is trying to strip them of the civilian distance Americans instinctively assign to them. And some names on that list hit harder than others. Boeing is one of them. Because Boeing is not just a brand. There it is symbolic of the bridge between industrial America and the violence of war. Once Boeing appears on a retaliation list, the story is no longer just Iran threatens tech. It becomes Iran is naming the machinery behind U.S. force. Palantir is the even sharper example. It builds data architecture for Project Maven, a Pentagon AI program used to process drone and satellite imagery and identify airstrike targets. Once a company tied to target processing architecture lands on the list, Tehran is not merely trying to frighten investors. It is telling everyone that the software spine of the battlefield is now within its retaliation logic. Now, that does not mean every accusation Iran makes is proven. It clearly benefits from overclaiming. It wants to justify escalation, terrify host states, and tell its own public that it is hitting back at the real sources of enemy power, not just making speeches. But exaggeration does not erase the deeper truth. Some of these firms really do sit close to the operational nervous system of American reach. And that is the layer official narratives on both sides would rather keep blurry. Tehran wants the moral cover of saying, it is striking complicity, not civilians. Washington wants to avoid an open public conversation about how dependent modern war has become on private sector infrastructure, cloud capacity, AI tools, and corporate presence scattered across allied territory. Each side hides behind the part of the truth that helps it. That is why the title is strategically strong. It is not simply accusing Trump of saying nothing. It is accusing the public response of not catching up to the strategic meaning of the event. Because once a state starts threatening commercial infrastructure this openly, we're prepared is not the same as, we have publicly explained the new battlefield. And here is where the threat stops looking like pure theory. The corporate layer of this war had already been touched before this target list became the headline. That is important, because once a line has been crossed once, later warnings no longer sound like empty performance. Iranian drone strikes had already damaged data centers linked to Amazon facilities in 2 countries in the region. So when Tehran expanded its rhetoric against American corporate infrastructure, it was not speaking into a vacuum. It was building on a battlefield that had already brushed against commercial systems and proven that the private layer was no longer untouchable. That changes the viewer's calculation immediately. You do not have to believe every future threat is fully executable. You only have to accept that the line between war assets and business assets has already been disturbed once. After that, the fear becomes rational. Every new warning forces companies and governments to imagine the second hit, the next outage, the next evacuation, the next panic memo. And that is how modern escalation works. Sometimes it is not a bigger explosion. Sometimes it is a smaller certainty. A smaller certainty that your office will remain just an office. A smaller certainty that your cloud region will remain just a business platform. A smaller certainty that the company helping power the modern economy is not also being read as part of the war machine. The cyber front makes that even worse, because cyber pressure does not need a spectacular visual to bite hard. It can spread anxiety through weak points, keep systems half alert, and make the war feel present long before the public sees dramatic destruction. Pro-Iranian hackers were already reported targeting sites in the Middle East and stretching toward the United States, raising risks for defense contractors, power stations, and water plants. So the threat against these companies is not confined to a missile or a drone. It sits inside a broader environment of disruption, where pressure can travel through networks, not just through the sky. That makes the list more dangerous than it first appears. A threat like this does not need to destroy 18 sites to succeed. It only needs to force 18 companies, and the governments around them, to spend the next stretch of time thinking like wartime actors, evacuation drills, insurance calls, cyber reviews, executive travel changes, embassy coordination, continuity plans, investor nerves. Strategic effect starts long before impact. This is also why the viewer urgently wants the answer to one question. If the enemy is already naming private infrastructure, what is the actual American plan? Not the general plan for the region, not the broad plan for deterrence. The actual plan for the buildings and systems that now sit inside the public threat envelope. And that is where Trump's posture becomes more than a soundbite. He has spent this period talking about timelines, off-ramps, pressure, and the possibility of ending the war soon, but the more he leans into the language of winding down, while Tehran leans into the language of expanding target categories, the more the audience feels that dangerous mismatch between strategic narration and strategic reality. In other words, the public optics are upside down. Iran sounds like the war is spilling wider. Trump sounds like the war is nearing an end. That contradiction itself creates retention pressure, because viewers instinctively know both things cannot be true in the same easy way. If the war is truly coming, why are 18 major firms suddenly under an explicit, timed threat? And if the war is not coming, then the word no in response to concern over the companies starts sounding less like strength and more like refusal to publicly sit with what just happened. That is why the title keeps its bite. The silence is not technical. It is psychological and strategic. It is the absence of a response that feels proportionate to the shift in the battlefield. There is another detail that matters, because it exposes the true targeting logic. The list was not purely American. That alone tells you Tehran was selecting for function, not just flag. One of the named firms appears to be G42, an Emirati AI company rather than an American one. That means the threat was not built purely around nationality or symbolism. It was built around the broader infrastructure web Tehran believes supports intelligence, computing, targeting, and strategic endurance across the region. That is a huge clue, because it widens the blast radius of the story beyond Washington and Tehran. Gulf states spent years building themselves as hubs for data, AI, logistics, and advanced services. In peacetime, they look like modernization and ambition. In wartime, the same success can start looking like exposure, because concentration of infrastructure becomes concentration of vulnerability, and once host states feel that, the pressure no longer moves in one direction, it moves outward. Governments start asking whether they invite in not only prosperity, but also a new class of wartime risk. Companies start asking whether the region is still a growth engine or whether it is becoming a corridor where civilian and strategic infrastructure can no longer be separated cleanly. That is the part mainstream coverage often misses because it feels too technical until it suddenly feels too personal. Data centers, AI campuses, cloud zones, finance hubs, enterprise platforms, industrial partners. These sound boring until a war starts speaking directly to them. Then the audience understands in a flash that the boring part was the real foundation all along. That is why the cleanest way to say this is also the harshest. AI infrastructure can no longer be treated as purely commercial. Part of it is now national security infrastructure. Once that becomes true, the war stops happening around private systems and starts happening through them. And once that happens, every future threat lands harder because the conceptual line is already broken. Now go back to the workers for a second, because that is the human anchor that keeps this story from turning into a policy seminar. Think about what it means to hear that the place you report to, the place your spouse works, the place your friend commutes to, is suddenly being described as part of a 1-kilometer danger zone. That is how wars stop feeling distant, without a single bomb needing to fall nearby that day. This is why the opening had to be dangerous. Not because drama is the goal, but because the event itself is already psychologically violent. A war list with Apple, Google, Microsoft, Boeing, and others on it is shocking. A war list that tells employees to leave and residents to move is worse. A war list met by a public shrug is worse still, and the broader threat atmosphere was already widening before this story hit. That matters because it means the audience is not overreacting. The system was already warning people that the map of risk was spreading. Americans had already been warned that groups supportive of Iran may target U.S. interests overseas or locations associated with Americans throughout the world. So the target list did not invent the danger out of thin air. It gave that danger a sharper corporate shape and made it feel immediate, local, and concrete. So here's the central question this whole video has been building toward. If Iran has started treating major companies and regional infrastructure as part of the target environment, what exactly has this war become? The answer is not comfortable, and it does not depend on whether every threatened strike happens exactly as advertised. If Tehran is fully serious and fully capable, then the war has already widened into the private architecture of American power. That means the next phase is not confined to classic military targets. It reaches through cloud, compute, AI, finance, industry, and the people working inside those systems. If Tehran is partly bluffing, exaggerating, or trying to win the information war through fear, the conclusion still stands. It has already forced Washington, Gulf states, and corporate America to accept that those assets are now being publicly described as legitimate or reciprocal targets. Even the bluff proves the boundary has already been crossed in strategic language. That is the dual truth that makes this story hard to shake. If the claim is true, the battlefield is wider than most viewers were told. If the claim is inflated, the battlefield is still wider than most viewers were told. Because once office locations, data centers, and giant firms are named in wartime language, the separation people relied on is already collapsing. So yes, the title lands when you read it correctly. Trump did not need to literally say nothing for viewers to feel that something went missing. Tehran delivered a threat with names, timing, radius, and consequence. The American side delivered confidence without equivalent specificity. In a moment like this, that is what silence feels like, and that is the conclusion you should not be able to shake after this ends. The war did not need a new mass casualty image tonight to become more dangerous. It became more dangerous the moment corporate sites were pulled into the grammar of retaliation, and the people inside those systems were told to think like they were living on the edge of the front line. Once a war starts naming office towers, AI systems, cloud infrastructure, and global firms as part of the target picture, you are no longer watching a conflict happening around the global economy. You are watching a conflict happening through it. Stay with this channel, because we follow the point where the headline stops and the machinery underneath starts to shake.